rain hit the cracked windshield of the 2012 Ford Transit like handfuls of gravel dumped from the sky. It was 4:15 a.m. on Route 9, a forgotten stretch of highway winding through the dense, towering pine forests of the Pacific Northwest. Up here, the trees didn't just border the asphalt. They bent toward each other at the canopy, blocking out whatever faint moonlight managed to pierce the storm clouds. Marcus Vance slammed his palm against his thigh, hard enough to sting, just to force his heavy eyelids open. His eyes were burning, raw with fatigue. He reached down into the cup holder, grabbed a scuffed metal thermos, and unscrewed the top with his teeth while keeping one trembling hand on the wheel. He took a long swig of cold, bitter coffee. It tasted like burnt earth, but it was all he had left after 12 straight hours on the road. Taped to the dashboard, held down by a strip of peeling yellow duct tape, was a faded photograph of his 7-year-old daughter, Maya. She was grinning brightly despite the pale skin and the pink hospital gown, holding a threadbare stuffed rabbit. Sticking out from behind the frame was a folded medical bill printed with bold red ink. Overdue notice, $14,280.40. 2 more drops. Marcus rasped into the dark cab, his voice dry and thin. Just 2 more drops, kiddo. Then we collect the overtime bonus, and Daddy brings you home. He reached out to turn the dial on the center console, searching for any local radio station, a late-night talk show, sports banter, music, anything to break the crushing isolation. But as the tuner needle dragged across the frequencies, the speakers emitted only a low, pulsing drone, vibrating like a rhythmic heartbeat underwater. Suddenly, the aftermarket GPS unit clipped to his air vent burst into a violent shower of white digital static. The bright blue line, mapping his path back to the state highway, dissolved. The digitized voice didn't give a standard recalculation prompt. Instead, it dropped an octave, warbling to the speakers in a dragged-out, unnatural slur. "In 0 feet, turn home." "Come on, piece of garbage," Marcus grunted, slapping the side of the plastic monitor. Before he could pull off to reset the device, the storm stopped. It didn't taper off into a light drizzle or soften with the wind. It ceased instantaneously, as if a tap had been shut off in the sky. In its place descended a fog so dense and stark white that it felt almost solid. The van's high beam struck the wall of mist and bounced right back, blinding Marcus with an impenetrable sheet of white glare. Panicking, Marcus slammed his boot on the brake pedal. The heavy van skidded, tires squealing as they slid off the wet asphalt and onto unexpected, sharp gravel. The vehicle bounced violently over rutted dirt, shaking the steering wheel free from Marcus's grip. The engine gave a sickening metallic shudder, spluttered violently twice, and died with a heavy, hollow click. Silence descended over the forest like a lead weight. Marcus sat frozen in the driver's seat, his chest heaving, hands gripping his knees. The engine heater groaned its last breath, blowing a faint gust of cold air onto his ankles. He listened intently, waiting for the sound of rain dripping from the pine needles or the howl of the night wind through the branches. Nothing. No crickets, no night birds, no rushing air. Just the sound of his own shallow, frantic breathing. He reached for his phone on the passenger seat. The screen lit up and no service. "Unbelievable," he muttered, turning the key in the ignition. Click. He tried again, grinding the key in the tumbler. Click, click. The battery was dead, completely drained. Swearing under his breath, Marcus unhooked a heavy steel maglite flashlight from the door pocket. He reached for the handle, pushed open the heavy driver's side door, and stepped out onto the gravel road. The moment his boots hit the ground, a strange sensation hit him. The air was unnervingly dry and cold, completely devoid of the damp, mossy scent of the Pacific Northwest forest. Instead, it smelled sharply of harsh chemicals. A dry, sterile scent that hit the back of his throat like a mix of formaldehyde with shavings and old furniture polish. He clicked on the flashlight, pointing the thick beam to the swirling white fog. 10 yards ahead, spanning across the narrow gravel road, stood an archway made of dark, rotted timber. Hanging from the center was a wooden plaque, entirely still despite the open air. Welcome to Hollow Creek, EST 1892, a place where memories never fade. Just beyond the archway, bathed in the outer fringe of his flashlight beam, sat a 1950s gas station. Parked beside an ancient, rust-eaten pump was a gleaming black vintage sedan. Standing beside the open fuel tank was an attendant dressed in a spotless, vintage green jumpsuit with red name badge. He was holding the gas nozzle pointed directly into the car, standing completely motionless. "Hey!" Marcus called out, raising the heavy beam of light. "Hey, man, my truck broke down back there. You got a landline inside." The man didn't respond. He didn't turn around, nor did his shoulders drop. He stood locked in place beneath the silent fog, staring straight into the side of the car. Marcus took 2 slow, cautious steps over the crunching gravel, keeping his steel flashlight raised like a baton. "Sir, excuse me. I don't mean to jump you, but my van is dead back there." No response. The attendant didn't even shift his weight. Marcus stepped onto the concrete pump island, the smell of chemical preservative hitting his nose with overpowering force. Up close, it was sharp enough to sting his nostrils. A dry, medical stench mixing with a faint scent of dried straw and motor oil that had evaporated decades ago. "Hey!" Marcus extended a trembling hand toward the man's shoulder. Before his fingers could make contact, the beam of his flashlight hit the attendant's profile and Marcus froze solid. His hand hovered an inch from the man's green jumpsuit, his stomach dropping into a cold pit. The man's eyes weren't real. They were heavy spheres of polished black glass, set deep into sunken, pale sockets. They didn't reflect the flashlight beam like human eyes. They absorbed it, gleamless and totally hollow. His skin had a tight, waxy sheen, stretched so taut across his cheekbones that it looked like stretched parchment. Down the side of his jawline, starting just behind the earlobe and disappearing into his starched collar, ran a fine, agonizingly neat row of black thread stitches. A brightly painted red smile sat across his lower face, utterly motionless. Marcus stumbled backward off the curb, his boots slipping on the edge of the concrete. A mannequin, his mind screamed, desperate to find an explanation. It's a prop, a vintage display for a roadside tourist trap. Right. Creative, Marcus muttered out loud, his voice cracking against quiet. Very real. He turned away from the pump, pointing his light toward the cobblestone path that led beyond the archway. The white fog parted slightly, inviting him forward into what appeared to be the town square. He expected to see a modern visitor center or a highway motel with a neon vacancy sign. Instead, he stepped into a settlement frozen in time. Ornate brass street lamps lined the cobblestones, glowing with an amber light that pulsed without any electrical hum. On either side of the wide street stood perfectly preserved 1950 storefronts, a barber shop with a faded striped pole, a soda fountain diner, a hardware store, and a bakery with trays of golden loaves displayed in the window. And everywhere Marcus looked, there were people. Dozens of townspeople occupied the sidewalks and porches, bathed in the warm, artificial light. At a glance, it looked like a thriving small town caught on a pleasant evening. To his left, a woman in a yellow floral dress stood on the porch of a Victorian home, holding a pewter watering can tipped over a window box of vibrant red geraniums. Across the street, two young boys in denim overalls sat on a wooden bench. One had his arm raised, pointing toward the sky, his mouth stretched wide in an open, joyful laugh. Outside the diner, an elderly gentleman in a tweed three-piece suit sat at a wrought iron table, holding a porcelain teacup inches from his lips. "Hello," Marcus shouted into the middle of the street, his voice echoing off the brick facades. "Is anyone real here? I need a tow truck." The sound of his voice died almost instantly, swallowed up by the heavy, damp air. No one turned. No one answered, driven by a sudden, frantic need to see a living face. Marcus rushed up to the front window of the soda diner. Inside, a young couple sat across from each other in a red vinyl booth over a single chocolate milkshake with two paper straws. Marcus slammed his palm against the glass. Thump, thump, thump. "Hey, can you hear me?" Neither of them moved a fraction of an inch. The teenage boy's glass eyes remained locked on the girl's stitched chin. Then Marcus noticed something that made his throat go completely dry. A large, black blowfly buzzed out of the air inside the diner. It circled the booth before landing directly on the teenage girl's wide-open, unblinking glass eye. Marcus watched in horrific fascination as the fly crawled slowly across her dark pupil, leaving a tiny trail through a thin layer of clear lacquer coat, before buzzing away toward the ceiling. She didn't blink. Her eyelids didn't even twitch. A cold, greasy sweat broke out across Marcus's neck. He yanked his phone from his pocket, tapping the screen frantically. The signal icon showed an empty gray X. Beneath it, his battery meter, which had been at 80% when he exited the van, was rapidly draining right before his eyes. 42%, 28%, 11%, 2%. The screen flickered black and went completely dead. No, come on," he swore, shoving the phone back into his coat. Whack! The sound was sharp, dry, and terrifyingly close, like a heavy piece of leather dropping onto hard stone. Marcus spun around, sweeping his flashlight across the cobblestones. The beam swept across the town fountain in the center of the square. Standing beside the concrete lip of the fountain was a small girl in a bright yellow raincoat, holding a red rubber ball under her arm. Marcus remembered passing her 10 seconds ago. She had been positioned facing away from him, looking toward the bakery display. Now, her body was still angled toward the bakery, but her head had been snapped around at an impossible, jagged angle, turned 180 degrees backward over her shoulder, and her fixed, glass eyes were staring directly into Marcus's face. Marcus felt his heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. He froze. His maglite beam locked onto the little girl in the yellow raincoat. The child didn't take a breath. Her chest was completely still, but her head, twisted violently around her spine, remained fixed in his direction. In the pale beam of light, Marcus could see the terrifying craftsmanship that held her together. Thin, flesh-colored wax bridged a tear near her throat, and fine nylon stitching braced her neck, like a brace hidden beneath her yellow collar. "Who did this to you?" Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. He didn't wait for an answer. Panic took over, hot and chaotic. He backed away slowly, keeping his flashlight trained on the child, until his heels slammed into the wooden porch of the town's general store. He spun around, gripped a rusted iron door handle, and threw his weight against it. The door swung open with a surprisingly smooth, silent glide. Marcus scrambled inside, slamming the heavy wooden door behind him and throwing the brass deadbolt into place. He leaned his back against the solid oak door, chest heaving, gulping down air. But the air inside the general store was worse than the foggy street outside. It was suffocatingly warm, thick with the heavy, cloying stench of dry sawdust, turpentine, borax, and old leather. Marcus clicked his flashlight down toward the floor, keeping the beam low to avoid drawing attention to the windows. He swept the beam across the store, and his stomach turned. The general store wasn't stocked with canned goods or supplies. It was a showroom of preserved human existence. Behind the long wooden counter stood the shopkeeper, a stout, middle-aged man in a checkered apron, mid-gesture as he handed a glass bottle of soda to a young mother. The mother's arms were outstretched, her hands wrapped in fine lace gloves. Beside her stood a wicker baby stroller. Marcus crept closer, drawn by a morbid, terrifying curiosity. He shone his flashlight into the stroller. Inside lay an infant. Its cheeks were painted an unnatural, rosy pink. Its tiny hands were curled into delicate fists. But up close, Marcus could see the tiny glass beads inserted into its eye sockets, held in place by microscopic dabs of clear epoxy. The baby's skin wasn't soft. It was hard, varnished, and held together along the inner wrist by tiny, cross-stitched sutures. God! Oh, God! Marcus breathed, pressing a hand over his mouth to suppress a gag. This wasn't a town of mannequins. This was an entire population of preserved human corpses. Every single person in Hollow Creek had been carefully gutted, stuffed, mounted, and posed to mimic a living, breathing community. Marcus stepped back from the stroller, his boot catching on a loose floorboard. Creak. The sound echoed to the silent shop like a gunshot. Marcus froze. He held his breath, staring at the shopkeeper behind the counter. For 5 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The shopkeeper remained still, his painted smile gleaming under the low light. Then Marcus heard a faint, high-pitched friction sound, like dry leather rubbing against wood. Squeak, creak. Slowly, deliberately, the shopkeeper's stretched fingers began to uncurl from around the glass soda bottle. The glass bottle didn't fall. It was held tightly by a rigid, dried tendon. The man's arm, stiff, wooden, and locking at the elbow, began to lift toward Marcus. Beside the counter, the young mother's head jerked 3 inches to the left with a sharp, mechanical snap. Her glass eyes rolled within her wax-lined sockets, adjusting until her hollow gaze locked onto Marcus's face. From every corner of the dark shop, faint wooden groans began to resonate. The joints of the mounted corpses were dry, stiff, and unyielding, yet something unseen was forcing them to move. Marcus backed toward the rear door of the store, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. "Stay back," he warned, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "I'm warning you." The shopkeeper took a step forward. His gait wasn't human. It was a horrifying, unnatural drag. His left leg swung out in a stiff arc, his hip joint popping with a loud, dry crack as the dried cartilage resisted the forced motion. His jaw dropped open, revealing a tongue that had been replaced with tightly packed cotton and sawdust, exposing a throat lined with black canvas lining. No sound came from his throat, only the dry, rustling noise of sawdust shifting inside his hollow chest. Marcus turned and bolted for the back door. He threw his body against the crash bar. The door burst open, and Marcus tumbled out into the pitch-black alleyway behind the shop, hitting the wet cobblestones hard. He scrambled to his feet, scraping his hands on the rough stone, and looked up at the sky. The white fog above the town was shifting. Deep within the thick overcast, high above the roofs of the old buildings, something hummed. It was a faint, low-frequency vibration that rattled the fillings in his teeth. The sound of massive tension, like giant steel cables being pulled taut across the sky. Marcus scrambled up from the cold cobblestones of the alley, his palms scraped raw and bleeding from the fall. He backed against the damp brick wall, his heart hammering violently against his ribs as he stared up at the churning fog overhead. The low, vibrating hum grew louder, vibrating straight through the soles of his work boots. It felt like standing beneath a massive high-voltage power line, a resonant tremor that vibrated in his teeth. Then, a noise shattered the quiet, a sound so loud, sudden, and harsh that Marcus gasped, dropping his flashlight onto the pavement. It was an air raid siren, mounted on top of the old town hall at the end of the alley. A rusted metal horn began to spin, wailing a deep mechanical groan that echoed off the brick storefronts. The tone rose in pitch, rising from a guttural growl into an agonizing, ear-splitting shriek that tore through the dead air hollow creek. Wah wah, wah wah, wah wah. As the siren wailed, the warm, golden glow of the brass street lamps flickered frantically, dying down into a dull, bloody crimson. The cozy, nostalgic atmosphere of the 1950s town dissolved instantly, plunged into a washed-out, shadowy hellscape. Marcus snatched his flashlight from the ground and looked back toward the open rear door of the general store. The shopkeeper was coming out. His movement was agonizingly slow, but relentless. His stiff leather shoes dragged over the threshold, making a dry, scraping sound against the brick. His right arm, locked at an awkward 90-degree angle, swung with a violent jerk at every step. Behind him, the young mother emerged from the darkness of the store, her lace-gloved hands twitching like dying spiders, her head still cocked at an impossible, broken angle. Marcus turned and bolted down the alley, taking wild, blind turns through the red-lit shadows. When he broke out onto the main boulevard, he skidded to a halt, the breath catching in his throat. The town square was no longer motionless. Under the wailing siren and the pulsing red light of the street lamps, the dozens of taxidermied citizens were waking up. The transition wasn't fluid. It was a horrifying symphony of snapping wood, stretching dried leather and tearing stitches. Crack, snap, riot. To his left, the woman in the yellow dress on the Victorian porch dropped her pewter-watering can. It clattered down the wooden steps, but she didn't chase it. Instead, her spine arched backward with a sickening crunch as her arms jerked upward into the air, pulled by an unseen force from above. Her glass eyes spun wildly in her sockets before locking straight onto Marcus. Across the street, the two young boys on the bench rose in unison. Their legs didn't bend naturally. Their knees locked rigid, pulling their legs forward like wooden nutcrackers. The boy who had been pointing at the sky now held his stiff hand outstretched toward Marcus, his mouth wide open in a frozen, silent scream of dried canvas and sawdust. Every corpse in the square was moving now, their limbs twitching, jerking, and snapping against decades of rigor mortis and hardened taxidermy wire. And they were all turning toward him. Marcus backed in the center of the street, spinning in circles, his flashlight beam sweeping across a tide of approaching, wide-eyed horrors. The old gentleman in the tweed suit was hobbling off the diner patio, his hip popping out of its dried socket with every step, dragging his leg behind him like dead wood. The gas station attendant, Earl, was marching down the middle of the road, his painted red smile stretched wide under his hollow glass eyes. They weren't walking on their own strength. Marcus could see it now. The uncanny, erratic twitching of their shoulders, the way their elbows were lifted upward as if being tugged by invisible marionette bars. They were surrounded, the circle of dead. Preserved Faces was closing in, blocking every escape route back to the van. "Get away from me," Marcus screamed, swinging his heavy steel flashlight through the air. "Get the hell away." He lunged toward a narrow gap between the bakery and the tailor shop. A female corpse in a polka-dot dress stepped into his path, her stiff arms reaching out to grab his jacket. Marcus swung the maglite with all his strength. Clang! The heavy aluminum flashlight struck her cheekbone. It didn't sound like hitting flesh. It sounded like striking a hollow plaster mannequin. The blow shattered the right side of her waxy face, caving in her cheek and popping her right glass eye straight out of its socket. The glass marble bounced across the cobblestones with a tiny clink. The woman didn't bleed. She didn't flinch. Sawdust and white borax powder spewed from the wound in her face, dusting Marcus's jacket. Her remaining glass eye stared blankly as her wooden fingers clamped onto his sleeve with crushing, artificial force. Marcus tore himself free, leaving a patch of his denim jacket behind in her grip, and dove into the dark gap between the buildings just as the air raid siren died down into a low, dying moan. The silence that followed was worse, because now, high above the rooftops, Marcus heard a new sound cutting through the thick fog. A soft, wet swish, 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 like massive, wet silk cables swinging through the sky. Marcus crouched in the narrow, dark gap between the bakery and the tailor shop, his chest heaving, hand clamped tightly over his mouth to muffle his ragged breathing. Cold sweat dripped off his chin, stinging his scraped knuckles. In the alleyway, the air grew unnaturally still once more. The siren's echo faded into mountains, leaving behind a silence so dense it made his ears ring. Then came the sound again. Swish, swish, swish. It was a wet, rhythmic whisper, like heavy ropes of wet silk dragged through tall grass, coming from high above the rooftops. Marcus pressed his back flat against the cold brick wall and slowly tilted his head upward toward the sky. The crimson glow of the street lamps illuminated the base of the thick white fog. High up in the mist, the clouds were churning in swirling geometric eddies, as if something impossibly massive was shifting just out of sight. Then, the first line dropped. It cut through the fog like a shooting star, a razor-thin, luminescent thread no thicker than a violin string, glowing with a sickly, pale blue phosphorescence. It didn't fall under gravity. It plunged straight down with purposeful, terrifying precision. Thwip! The thread struck the roof of the bakery. With a wet snap, Marcus flinched, pulling back deeper into the shadows. He watched in sheer disbelief as more threads began to descend in the cloud cover. Dozens of them, then hundreds, falling like a shimmering, translucent rain across the entire town. Each thread dropped directly onto a specific target. Through a gap between the wooden fence slats, Marcus saw a thread plunge into the top of the gas station attendant's skull. There was no blood, no splatter, just a soft, sickening squelch as the glowing line pierced the dried bone and anchored itself deep inside the man's hollow chest cavity. Another thread shot down, splitting into fine, spiderweb-like splinters that whipped around his wrists, elbows, and ankles, burning slightly as they cinched tight against the waxy skin. The moment the lines connected, the attendant shuddered violently. His body didn't move on human muscle. It was yanked upward. His heels lifted 3 inches off the cobblestones, suspended by the tension of the glowing skylines. His head snapped skyward, his polished black glass eyes reflecting the pale blue light of the thread stretching thousands of feet into the infinite void above. God in heaven, Marcus breathed, his voice barely a gasp. High above the clouds, the source of the lines pulled back on its reins. With a horrific clack, 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 the townspeople were hoisted up by their joints, their wooden knees unbent. Their shoulders were pulled back into place, and their stiff fingers flared open like flowers blooming in fast forward. The glowing threads pulsed with a rhythmic liquid light, pumping an oily, luminescent fluid directly into preserved corpses, causing their dry veins to glow faint blue beneath their varnished skin. Marcus looked up at the sky, trying to trace the lines to their apex. The threads didn't come from a machine, or a tower. They descended from a silhouette hovering silently within the deep, rolling fog, a shape so colossal it dwarfed the town square. It looked like a multi-limbed geometric monstrosity, its limbs moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a spider sitting on a web that spanned the entire valley. Massive, pale wood crossbeams, carved like gargantuan marionette controls, tilted back and forth inside the clouds, pulling and slackening the thousands of lines attached to the dead below. Suddenly, a thread dropped into the narrow alleyway just 4 feet in front of Marcus. Thwip! It sliced through a wooden trash crate like a hot knife through butter, embedding itself into the cobblestones. The thread thrummed with a high-pitched, vibrating whistle, illuminating Marcus's mud-stained boots with its ghostly blue light. Marcus froze. He didn't dare breathe. Above him, the gargantuan shadow in the clouds paused. One of the massive wooden crossbeams tilted slowly, adjusting its angle toward the alley. The glowing thread in front of Marcus began to sweep across the pavement, dragging back and forth like a blind finger searching for a lost coin. It brushed against the hem of his jeans, and instantly, a searing heat shot through the denim, scorching the fabric. Marcus panicked. He leaped backward, kicking off the brick wall, and threw himself out the other side of the alley into an open courtyard behind the town church. The moment his body cleared the alley, the sky above erupted in a chorus of dry, wooden creaks. Hundreds of glass eyes swung in unison toward the courtyard. The strings had felt him. The grand puppeteer had felt a break in its web. Marcus scrambled across the churchyard's muddy grass, his chest burning as he lunged to the iron-ringed side door of the old wooden chapel. Behind him, the air filled with a terrifying sound, 100 stiff joints popping at once, a chorus of snapping wood, stretching dried tendons and tearing varnish. The marionette strings high in the sky tautened with a sharp, metallic ping. Up in the fog, the massive wooden crossbeams tilted sharply. Down on the ground, dozens of taxidermied townspeople were yanked off their feet. They didn't run like living humans. They swung forward in horrifying, parabolic arcs, their boots levitating inches above the ground before slamming down onto the cobblestones with jarring force. Thump, thump, thump. A young woman in a high-collar Victorian dress swung over the churchyard wall. Her body hung perfectly vertical, suspended by 3 glowing blue lines anchored into her skull and shoulder blades. Her legs kicked out in stiff mechanical swings, her petticoats rustling dryly like dead leaves. "Get away!" Marcus yelled, hurling a heavy stone garden gnome from the church path. The stone struck her chest square on. It caved in her ribs with a dry, hollow crunch, caving her torso in like an old cardboard box. Sawdust and dried lavender exploded from her chest in a pale cloud, but she felt no pain. She didn't even slow down. The skylines yanked her upward, her arms snapping forward like spring-loaded traps, her glass eyes fixed wide in an unblinking, endless stare. Marcus reached the heavy oak door of the chapel, threw his weight against the latch, and burst inside. He slammed the door, throwing 2 heavy iron bolts across the frame, just as a barrage of stiff bodies slammed against the outside paneling. Bang, bang, crack. The oak door shuddered, dust falling from the high arched rafters. Marcus turned around, leaning his weight against the shivering door, his breath coming in jagged, wheezing gasps. Inside, the chapel was plunged into cool, shadow-drenched twilight. High stained glass windows cast long, eerie violet patterns across the wooden pews. And sitting in those pews were 30 more residents of Hollow Creek. Marcus's blood ran cold. He froze, his mag light beam trembling as he swept it across the congregation. They were seated in rows, dressed in their Sunday best. Men in dark wool suits, women in wide-brimmed lace hats, children sitting perfectly straight with their hands folded in their laps. Every single one of them was a masterpiece of taxidermy. Their skin was pristine, coated in clear protective glaze, their glass eyes glistening under the violet light. At the front altar stood the preacher. He was dressed in black robes, his hands raised in eternal benediction toward a giant wooden crucifix hanging on the wall. Fwip, fwip, fwip. Without warning, the high glass windows shattered. Streams of pale blue light shot through the stained glass as dozens of glowing skylines plunged straight through the roof tiles and rafters into the chapel. The threads rained down on the congregation with surgical precision, piercing skulls, spines, and wrists. The pews groaned. In unison, 30 heads snapped backward with a horrifying, synchronized crack. The congregation rose. They didn't stand up using their legs. The lines yanked them straight upward into the air, their pews tumbling over as their feet dragged across the aisle. Their arms swung out, their stiff fingers twitching as the blue fluid pumped into their hollow bodies, making their dry veins glow beneath their waxy skin. The preacher at the altar spun around, his jaw unlatched, dropping 4 inches past his chin, hanging by a thick strip of dried leather. From his hollow throat came no voice, only a terrifying, high-pitched whistling sound as the air inside the church was sucked up toward the ceiling by the tension of the strings. They moved in a coordinated, grotesque ballet. A butcher with a leather apron leaped over the center pews, suspended by 5 skylines, his stiff legs swinging like pendulums. A mother dragging 2 small children on glowing tethers swept down the main aisle, her glass eyes locked onto Marcus. They were cutting off his exit. Marcus sprinted toward the altar, dodging a flying corpse that swung past his head like a pendulum weight. He reached the side door behind the pulpit, a narrow door leading down into the church cellar. He kicked the latch free, threw the door open, and hurled himself down the stone steps into the darkness just as a dozen stiff hands clawed at his shirt. He tumbled down the concrete steps, hitting the floor hard, and rolled into the pitch-black basement as the heavy cellar door slammed shut above him, instantly plunging him into absolute silence. Marcus lay at the bottom of the cellar stairs, gasping for breath as dark, ice-cold air filled his lungs. The damp floor smelled heavy of limestone, wet coal, and that familiar, sickeningly sweet stench, formaldehyde, resin, and old leather. Above him, the heavy oak cellar door vibrated with rhythmic, dull thuds as the dangling puppets slammed their wooden feet against it. But down here, the stone walls muffled the sound, turning the horror upstairs into a distant, frantic thrum. Marcus clicked his dented mag light back on. The flickering yellow beam cut through a thick cloud of swirling dust, illuminating a massive subterranean workshop spanning beneath the entire church and town square. "This isn't a church basement," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling as he picked himself up. "It's a factory." Row after row of long, steel-top operating tables stretched into the darkness. Hanging from iron meat hooks along the ceiling were dozens of human-shaped wooden frames, skeletal armatures made of carved oak, flexible brass joints, and iron tension springs. On shelves lining the stone walls sat thousands of glass eyes arranged by color, jars of thick amber varnish, spools of heavy surgical thread, and galvanized tubs filled with borax and dried sawdust. Marcus walked slowly down the central aisle, his boots crunching over shattered glass and wood shavings. On one table lay a half-finished townsperson, an old woman whose chest had been opened, revealing a hollow cavity packed neatly with fragrant cedar wood shavings and straw. Her skin was pulled taut over a wooden torso, held in place by row upon row of neat, cross-stitched thread. At the far end of the hall stood a heavy oak desk illuminated by a single oil lamp that burned with an eerie, steady flame. Marcus approached the desk, his flashlight beam landing on a massive leather-bound ledger lying open beside a brass taxidermist tool set. He wiped a layer of white borax dust off the yellow parchment pages. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and obsessive. Entry: October 14th, 1892. The sickness takes them all. First the children, then the mothers. The fever leaves their lungs ruined and their skin gray. I cannot let this town rot. I cannot let their smiles decay into memory. If God will not keep my beloved Hollow Creek whole, I will forge a sanctuary where no one ever ages, no one ever dies, and no one ever leaves. Marcus turned the brittle page. Detailed anatomical sketches filled the margins, diagrams showing how to drain organs, how to reinforce human spines with steel rods, and how to attach silk threads to internal bone pins, so the body could be manipulated from above. Entry: November 2nd, 1892. The preservation of the body is simple: borax, arsenic, and varnish. But to give them motion, to make them live, requires a higher covenant. I made the call into the fog above the valley. Something answered. It offered its threads to hold my people up. All it demands in return is fresh thread, fresh bone, fresh blood. A cold wave of horror washed over Marcus. He looked at the final entry, dated just a few days prior. The ink was fresh, dark, and hastily scribbled across the bottom of the page. The display requires new pieces. The courier carries a driver's license. His name is Marcus. He will make a fine addition to the postal delivery scene. Marcus dropped the ledger, his heart hammering against his ribs. Beside the ledger sat a wooden display rack. Resting on a felt velvet pad was a pair of newly polished glass eyes, painted a deep dark brown, matching Marcus's exact eye color. Next to the glass eyes sat a small metal brass tag, freshly engraved: Marcus Vance, Postal Service. A sudden, sharp metallic vibration echoed through the cellar. Thwip, thwip, thwip. Marcus spun around, sweeping his flashlight upward. The stone ceiling of the basement was cracking. Long, glowing blue skylines were burning their way straight through 6 feet of solid rock and mortar, piercing the underground workshop like needles through cloth. The hanging wooden armatures on the meat hooks began to swing. The half-finished corpses on the steel tables twitched as the lines plunged into their open chest cavities, pulling them upright. Marcus scrambled backward toward a heavy iron boiler door at the back of the workshop, his chest heaving. He wasn't just a lost driver trapped in a ghost town. He was the missing piece of their permanent display. Marcus backed up until his shoulder blades hit the icy iron of the coal furnace. The workshop was now bathed in a sickening, aquatic blue glow as dozens of skylines tore through the stone ceiling, hanging down like long, glowing tendrils. The half-finished corpses on the steel operating tables groaned as the threads anchored into their exposed, straw-filled ribs. But they weren't moving to attack him. Not yet. They were clearing a path. From a far corner of the basement, beyond the shadow of the heavy meat hooks, came the wet, heavy sound of dragging cloth and clicking bone. Suspended by a thick cluster of nearly 20 glowing lines was the town taxidermist himself, the author of the ledger. His body was a towering, grotesque patchwork of aged leather, dried sinew, and metal brace pins. His left arm had been completely replaced with a polished brass apparatus featuring long, surgical needles and suture blades where fingers should be. His eyes were giant, magnifying glass lenses set into leather sockets, gleaming under the blue light. Swish, clack. The taxidermist swung forward, his boots hovering an inch off the floor as the skylines manipulated his limbs with terrifying, flew at speed. Beside him, suspended on a single heavy tether, hung a glass display case that had been recently rolled into the cellar. Marcus's flashlight beam illuminated the interior of the case, and his heart nearly stopped. Inside was a fully constructed scene set, a replica of a mail sorting desk, complete with leather delivery bag, brass scales, and a stack of tiny handwritten letters. Sitting behind the desk was a wooden chair with leather straps attached to the armrests and leg pegs. The seat was empty, waiting for him. "You're late?" a voice rasped. It didn't come from the taxidermist's throat. His mouth was sewn completely shut with thick black cord. The sound vibrated directly from the glowing skylines overhead, pitched like a dry, rasping wind blowing through empty pipes. The route must be completed. The display must be whole. "Stay the hell back," Marcus screamed, grabbing a heavy iron poker resting against the furnace. He lunged forward, swinging the rod with all his weight. Clang! The iron rod struck the taxidermist's brass arm, sending a shower of sparks into the dark air. The impact vibrated through Marcus's arms, knocking him back a step, but the taxidermist didn't even reel. With a sickening silent flick of the overhead crossbeams, 3 glowing skylines whipped down from the ceiling like razor wire. Marcus dodged sideways, but the threads were too fast. One line grazed his left forearm. Marcus shrieked as a blinding, searing heat burned straight through his jacket sleeve. The glowing thread didn't just cut him. It hooked into his skin like a burning needle, sinking deep into his flesh until it anchored against his bone. Instantly, a strange, terrifying sensation spread from his arm. His fingers didn't burn anymore. They went completely icy cold. He watched in horror as the skin around the entry wound began to lose its color, turning a waxy, translucent white. The muscles in his forearm locked up, not out of pain, but because his blood was freezing, hardening inside his veins like setting epoxy. "No, no!" Marcus panicked, grabbing his arm. He couldn't bend his fingers. They were locked in an open, curved claw, exactly like the hands of the corpses upstairs. High above, the grand puppeteer yanked on the thread. Marcus's left arm flew upward against his control. The tension pulled him off his feet, dragging his body toward the open glass display case. His arm felt weightless, light as dry wood, completely severed from his mind's command. "Maya," Marcus gasped, his vision blurring with tears of pain and absolute terror. He pulled the photo of his daughter from his jacket pocket with his right hand, his breathing coming in frantic, hyperventilating rasps. "I have to get back to Maya." The taxidermist's brass arm clicked open, the surgical needle spinning like a horrifying mechanical drill as he swung closer. "She will be preserved too," the rasping voice echoed from the strings above. "All broken things come home to Hollow Creek." That thought, the image of his little girl sitting in a glass box with glass eyes, shattered Marcus's fear, replacing it with a wave of desperate, violent rage. Marcus grabbed the iron poker with his remaining good hand, shoved the tip straight into the glowing blue line hooked into his left forearm, and twisted the iron with all the strength left in his body. The iron poker ground into the glowing blue skyline hooked into Marcus's arm. Sparks of pale, burning light showered over his face as he forced the metal rod against the taut thread, twisting with every ounce of strength in his body. Snapping, the line snapped like a high-tension guitar string, whipping back toward the ceiling with a deafening, sonic crack. Agony shot through Marcus's left arm as the waxy numbness shattered, sensation rushing back in a tidal wave of burning pain. Blood welled from the entry wound on his forearm, dark and red, real human blood, dripping onto the cold stone floor. High above, the massive gargantuan silhouette in clouds lurked with guttural, vibrating roar that shook the foundation of the underground workshop. The loss of that single connection sent a shock wave through the web. The taxidermist staggered back, his brass arm flailing as several of his own controlling skylines slackened and went limp. Now or never, Marcus growled through gritted teeth. He didn't run for the cellar stairs. He knew the congregation was waiting above. Instead, he grabbed an iron canister of liquid turpentine from the workshop shelf, slammed it against the base of the oil lamp on the taxidermist's desk, and kicked the burning lamp straight into the spill. Fush! A wall of bright orange fire erupted across the taxidermist's desk, instantly swallowing the open ledger, the glass display cases, and the spools of thread. The flames licked high, catching the dry straw and cedar shavings packed inside the half-finished corpses. The heat was instantaneous and blinding. As the preserved bodies caught fire, the glowing blue skylines began to turn black, melting and snapping like monofilament fishing line exposed to a torch. Above the town, the grand puppeteer shrieked, a high, mechanical wail of agonizing tension losing its grip. Marcus turned and sprinted toward the back of the cellar, where a rusted coal chute led upward toward the alleyway. He wedged his boots into the metal rivets, scrambling up the steep, narrow incline on his hands and knees as black. Chemical smoke filled the underground chamber. He burst through the rusting iron hatch at the top, tumbling out into the night air. The scene in the town square was complete chaos. The fire below was venting to the sewer grates, bathing the fog in a terrifying, flickering orange light. Deprived of their controlling threads, dozens of taxidermied townspeople were collapsing like felled timber. Their limbs jerked wildly as their lines snapped, sending them crashing onto the cobblestones in lifeless, rigid piles of wood, glass, and cloth. Fwhip snap, fwhip snap. The sky was raining severed strings. Marcus scrambled to his feet, ignoring the agony in his left arm, and sprinted down the center street toward the wooden archway. Behind him, the remaining puppets weren't walking anymore. The grand puppeteer, desperate not to lose his fresh prize, was dragging them across the stone. Dozens of stiff, twitching corpses being reeled backward toward the center town like dead fish on a line, their glass eyes fixed on Marcus as they scraped across the ground. Marcus sprinted past the soda diner, past the gas station, and dove under the wooden archway, hurling his body across the property line. The moment his boots crossed the boundary beneath the Welcome T.O. Hollow Creek sign, the air changed instantly. The dry, sterile smell of formaldehyde and varnish evaporated, replaced by the damp, cold scent of pine needles and wet dirt. The deafening siren, the crackle of fire, and the high-pitched whistling of the skylines vanished into absolute dead silence. Marcus hit the wet gravel road hard, rolling twice before coming to a stop beside his broken-down delivery van. He lay on his back in the mud, gasping for cold, damp air, his chest heaving as tears of pain and relief washed down his soot-stained face. He lifted his left hand. It was bruised, bloodied, and burned, but his fingers bent when he told them to. He was alive. He was human. He pulled the crumpled photograph of Maya out of his pocket, pressing the wet paper against his forehead, sobbing quietly into the quiet night air. Then, from inside the van cab, came a sudden, sharp sound. Beer-ring. The dashboard radio cracked to life with clear, static-free audio. The van's engine flared to life on its own, the headlights sweeping across the road, illuminating the gravel highway ahead. The fog behind the archway was receding, rolling back into dark pine forest like a retreating tide. Marcus pulled himself up, climbed into the warm cab of his van, and slammed the door shut. He shifted into gear, slammed his boot onto the accelerator, and tore down the gravel road, leaving Hollow Creek behind in his rear-view mirror. The asphalt of Route 9 felt solid beneath the tires. Real rain hit the windshield now, cold, heavy, and smelling of damp cedar and earth. Marcus drove with both hands glued to the wheel, his left arm bandaged tightly with a strip of torn cloth from his flannel shirt. The engine hummed with a steady, comforting rhythm, and the dashboard clock read 5:42 a.m. The first soft gray light of dawn was finally bleeding through the eastern clouds. In the passenger seat, the heater blew warm air over his frozen knees. Marcus reached over with a trembling hand and picked up the photograph of Maya, smoothing out the crumpled edges before taping it back onto the vent. "I'm coming home, Maya," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm coming home right now." 20 minutes later, the van pulled into the brightly lit bay of the Central Courier Depot in Portland. The morning shift was already bustling. Forklifts hummed across the concrete floor. Workers shouted over the sound of sorting belts, and the smell of fresh black coffee filled the air. To Marcus, the noise of ordinary human life felt like the sweetest music he had ever heard. He stepped out of the cab, his legs feeling heavy as lead. His supervisor, Dan, a burly man with a clipboard tucked under his arm, walked over, squinting at Marcus's torn jacket and soot-stained face. "Jesus, Vance," Dan said, whistling through his teeth. "You look like you wrestled a bear out on Route 9. What happened to your arm?" "Engine trouble," Marcus said quietly, handing over his electronic delivery clipboard. "Lost my way in the fog, but the route is finished." Dan looked down at the tablet, tapping the screen. "Well, you made all your drops except the last one. System log a route deviation around 4:30 a.m. Marcus froze, his pulse jumping. "Route deviation?" "Yeah. Says here your GPS pinged off a rural county line that hasn't been active since the 90s. Dan muttered, swiping to the logs. "Anyway, doesn't matter. You got enough hours logged to hit your overtime threshold. The bonus check goes through to your account today." Marcus closed his eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath. The debt was covered. Maya's treatment could continue. He nodded, unable to speak, and walked toward his personal car parked in the employee lot. 3 days later, the afternoon sun poured through the blinds of room 312 at St. Jude's Children's Hospital. Maya sat up in her bed, her color looking remarkably better. She giggled as Marcus carefully brushed her hair, leaning her head back against his shoulder. Her medical file sat on the bedside table, stamped with a blue ink seal. Payment received, status, active. "Dad," Maya asked softly, looking up at him. "Yeah, kiddo? You're holding the brush kind of stiff." Marcus paused, looking down at his left hand. The burn on his forearm had healed into a jagged, faint scar, but his middle and ring fingers were still slightly rigid, a dull reminder of the line that had hooked his bone. He forced a smile and loosened his grip. "Just tired, sweetie. Dad worked a really long shift." "Is that why you got me a present?" she asked, pointing toward the windowsill. Marcus frowned, setting the brush down. "What present?" "The package on the windowsill," Maya said, her small eyebrows knitting together. "The nurse brought it in this morning. She said a driver left it at the front desk for you." Marcus's stomach dropped. He walked slowly across the linoleum floor toward the window. Sitting on the radiator was a small, square brown box tied with heavy, coarse twine. Attached to the top was a yellowed shipping label. The destination address was printed in clean, crisp ink. Room 312, Maya Vance. Marcus reached out, his heart hammering against his ribs, and picked up the box. It was surprisingly heavy, filled with a faint, unmistakable scent of cedar with shavings and dried lavender. He pulled the twine free and opened the cardboard flaps. Inside, resting on a bed of fine with straw, was a carved wooden music box shaped like a tiny delivery truck. Sitting in the driver's seat was a beautifully painted wooden figurine of Marcus, wearing a green jacket, holding a miniature steering wheel. Marcus lifted the figurine out of the box with trembling fingers. He turned it over in his hand. Stamped into the base of the wooden figure was a small brass plaque. Marcus Vance, Postal Service, a place where memories never fade. Marcus stared at the figurine in horror as he turned it toward the light. He noticed a microscopic hole drilled straight to the top of the figure's miniature wooden head, and tied to the hole was a single paper-thin, clear nylon thread that stretched straight up toward the hospital ceiling, disappearing into the dark drop tiles above. High above the hospital roof, deep within the calm blue summer sky, a soft, wet sound echoed into the void. Swish, swish, swish.